Hello there again, and welcome to Unit 10 in our animal nutrition class, which covers sheep feeding. And kind of a shorter section here as we dive into Chapter 10 in your textbook and approaching the end of the semester here. And one of our later end species we'll talk about is sheep. The objectives here, you can review those on your own time. Let's get in and talk about the feeding program. As with all the other species that we've talked about, sheep are no different. Feed is the single largest cost of production, and it really doesn't matter what type of sheep operation that we're talking about. So we have to be able to support optimum production, promote efficiency, be really economical to feed with our feeding program, and minimize those metabolic problems, just like we've been talking about with all the other species. So let's first examine that feeding ration for maybe the breeding flock, those ewes out there. We consider them probably the most important animal to our sheep operations because of raising those lambs that we're talking about later in terms of market lambs. A little bit on wool production. Now in the States nowadays, wool harvest off of sheep isn't really that valuable of a commodity, and in many operations is just simply discarded. But both of those are greatly influenced by nutritional um, supplements and feeding programs in your diet. So make sure that we are feeding these programs here in this next few slides. Pay attention because that drives all those things importantly. Genetics are really critical, obviously, but the feeding program is crucial. Sheep producers really, this is surprising to a lot of producers out there. Sheep guys can make more income over investment than any other meat animal. Sheep and lambs are actually very efficient gainers and very efficient in terms of converting low quality feeds to good quality meat. The problem is there's just not much market out there. So there's some people that challenge that occasionally in class over the years. But in terms of income over investment, sheep are actually quite economical. Recommended flock sizes there, and we talk about one ram for every 35 ewes is probably about right in terms of ratios. Then you got to look at a lambing system, and you can consider maybe early lambing January to February, and there's a lot of management stuff here. There's some pricing in terms of what's maybe best May through June, high lamb market prices, more maybe available labor. But from a feeding perspective, you get more control over the feed ration whenever you early lamb. You get more control over the parasite problems because there's less of them and they're less severe coming out of that wintertime time frame. Stocking rate can be quite a bit higher because we're not focusing on pasture providing a lot of our ration nutrient needs, so we can maybe put more sheep on the same pasture. And you don't necessarily need that expensive facilities, but you need something that will keep them out of the mud and the wind and the rain, and keep those baby lambs safe and sound and starting off healthy after lambing. The late lambing time, March through April, so to speak. Now we're talking about transitioning your feeding program to something that's maybe a bit cheaper, and so forages provide the most of the feed, the bulk of the feed for the ewes and the lambs both. Here we're talking about maybe facilities that don't need to be quite as good as the early lambs, especially in southern Illinois. We talk about our winter variations that we have. You don't need necessarily much of a barn facility to keep them clean and dry and out of the wind, but you might need a little bit. Um, Lambs marketed that these March and April lambs, this late lambing period. Sometimes you can market lambs without hardly putting any concentrate in them at all. They can kind of be done sold as feeders without very much feed exposure, supplemented feed exposure at all. So it gets very cheap, and so what we find then is lamb prices sometimes are substantially lower in fall and early winter. So that's maybe why you see some people that will shy away from March and April late lambing. But high quality pastures for those guys are a must. And then when you talk about putting that as the focal point of your feeding ration, then parasite control is absolutely critical, and your risk of infestation is high. Lambs can graze right close to the ground. Sheep can graze right almost to the soil line, so their risk of exposure to parasites is really, really high. So you have to make sure that you have a good parasite control program in place. In terms of feed requirement, well, let's look at one ewe and maybe a pair of lambs that she's raising alongside of her. We're looking at potentially, basically, just simply 4 bushels of grain and about 800 pounds of hay per year. That's a yearly budget, feeding budget for those things. And if you have about 6 months of good quality pasture grazing and 2 months of winter pasture, or substitute that with 800 pounds hay, that will really do the same thing. If we talk about adding poor quality hay to the diet, then we're probably going to talk about more grain supplementation, obviously. For maintenance, ewes like 3 to 8 years of age, so to speak. Again, we're just really wanting to feed them enough to maintain physiological function from weaning until about 15 weeks of gestation. And then obviously, when we talk about during that transitional time into lactation, preventing very much body weight loss. Again, monitor body. Pasture generally is adequate for maintaining ewes, and especially if good quality is available. So good quality pasture maintenance will provide you with a lot of profitability options here. At breeding time, again, remove those ewes from pasture about 2 weeks before breeding season. There's some research that indicates, especially when we're talking about legumes on the pasture, that will interfere somewhat hormonally with reproductive success. So it's maybe a good time at breeding time to get them off of pasture for about a couple weeks. Invest in a little bit of hay that doesn't have a lot of legume in it, and you'll get more reproductive success. And you'll start to condition those ewes in order to bring them into breeding about the same time and shorten that lambing window. So again, synchronize them up as best that you can in order to keep your lambs as consistently born about the same time as what you can. After breeding, gestation in sheep is about 150 days. So about the first 3.5 months, all we're going to do is maintain body condition again. Good pasture, a little bit of good quality hay, maybe a wee bit of grain with some mineral vitamin in it, or just simply a mineral vitamin pack might provide all that you really need. The last month and a half is really where it gets critical prior to lambing time. And if we do some really bad things in this point in time, if we have poor pasture quality, poor hay, then we're going to get some of the things that are listed right here in terms of problems. Lambing paralysis or pregnancy disease, is it called, weak lambs, or drops in milk production, which will then result in weak and lost lambs. But really, energy requirements are increasing almost exponentially during this period. So now's a good time to supplement a little bit of grain. Now's your time to spend a little bit of money on those ewes out there. So add maybe just a touch of protein, and again, your mineral vitamin packs as well. Pasture ewe nutrition, then, if we look at those ewes out there, again, look at your stocking density, because a lot of that affects the pasture quality and pasture nutritional content. Pastures that are overgrazed are very unproductive and unpalatable, because they will pick the grasses and the grass types and the grass maturity that tastes the best to them, and they will graze around the rest of it. So pasture we've talked about a number of times in a number of different sections is really, really crucial here for lambs and sheep as well. Pasture forages primarily should be grass in base. So utilize a good mixture of cool and warm season grasses, good orchard grass, a little bit of timothy maybe. Brome grass is always good when we talk about warm season grasses. And then maybe just a touch of some alfalfa or clover, something that provides a little bit more higher protein source than your mature grasses. On supplementation, then, it really depends on what you see out the window there in terms of condition and quality of your pasture. That determines how much energy, crude protein, phosphorus, vitamin A, water, zinc, all of those types of things that you might need to supplement. But use care not to increase your cost too much. You can really spend a lot of money here because that makes you feel better. Make sure that it is the right thing for your program, for your operation, to start supplementing your pasture with grain, because it's going to increase your cost. A couple things in terms of disease risks here, and one of the big ones is what we call pregnancy disease, lambing paralysis, and essentially this is ketosis or acidemia, and it's caused by not enough usable carbohydrates in the diet, is what that stands for, CHO, not enough usable carbohydrates in the diet. So what they do is they start mobilizing body fat, and as that happens, then they don't feel like eating, and we've talked about that before. But generally, this affects older ewes, especially those carrying twins or triplets, more often than it affects the younger ewes. And so you'll start to see a trend if you have this problem, that those ewes that are in poor body condition coming in, they will tend to have this problem more often. You'll be able to smell an acetone smell on their breath. It's kind of a sweet smell if you've never smelt that before. But as you watch them, they'll lag behind the flock. They'll maybe stagger or get down and can't get up. That's the paralysis part. So how do you prevent that? Well, just enough energy content prior to lambing and maintaining proper body condition prevents it. Treatment of pregnancy disease, a little bit of molasses in the diet, some propylene glycol or sugar water like is dextrose here, really takes care of that. So if you're starting to see it in a trend in a group of ewes, a quarter to a half a pound per head per day of molasses in the diet. You can go to just about any feed store and get dried molasses, and it's not very expensive. Add that to the diet, and that will somewhat help them. Now, don't get carried away. Don't go up to like a pound of molasses per day, because again, that's a lot of sugar, and they will start adding body weight, and you'll probably cause more problems than you fix. So keep it under control if you have sheep out there that you're wanting to feed and prevent pregnancy disease. A quarter to a half a pound feeding rate, and I would start at the quarter and see how they respond before I went up to the half, because even though we're talking about not a great investment in terms of molasses, it's again all adds cost, and you don't want to spend any more than you have to here. The lactating ewe, much like the dairy cow that we just got done talking about, 2 to 3 times greater nutritional need than their maintenance. So whatever maintenance is, multiply that by 2 to 3, and that's really what the lactation need is in a ewe. So with twin lambs, they produce about 20 to 40% more milk than singles, and twins are very, very common. So adjust those nutritional requirements accordingly. Milk production peaks at about 2 to 3 weeks after lambing and lasts generally until about 8 weeks after lambing time, and they're going to make about 6 pounds or so, plus or minus, of milk a day. And so make sure that you realize that milk is the primary source of nutrition for those baby lambs out there. Again, they're not going to have fully functioning rumens until 2 or 3 months of age as well, just like a calf. So that milk is really, really critical, and you have to support that lactating ewe as best you can. One of the odd things is next on the slide. Don't force a ewe to eat right away after lambing. Almost every other animal that we talked about, you would say get those animals eating as quick as you can. That actually causes problems in ewes. I can't necessarily explain physiologically why. It tends to cause some of the pregnancy disease issues or some of the other health problems that you could experience in lambs or ewes. So just provide them enough clean, fresh water. Make sure that there's a little bit of feed slowly, but if it takes them a couple days to get eating, it's really not an emergency yet. Most of us that have other animals, we would be pretty concerned with a newly freshened cow or a newly foaled mare that hasn't eaten anything in 3 days. We would be probably calling the veterinarian, but not the case when we talk about ewes. If they don't eat very much until about day 3, that's pretty normal for them. So sometimes a good idea is to split your feeding times. That decreases your risks of acidosis and slug feeding. So if they're nursing 2 or 3 lambs, split up their feeding times 2 to 3 times a day accordingly. Lambs then, those early new life lambs, they've got to be nursing within the first half hour or first hour at the maximum. And most do so within that first 30 minutes. Again, antibody transfer is really critical in that colostrum. So hopefully you're getting 6 to 8 ounces of colostrum into those baby lambs. And if you've got to bottle feed them, do so if necessary. There are some colostrum supplements out there that if you can't get a lamb up and going, or you've got an orphaned one, get keep some of that on hand because it may save a baby lamb's life. The largest portion of lamb loss is due to starvation, actually, during that first week. That mother ewe just can't make enough milk production. So, that's where you really have to think about monitoring body condition scores, monitoring your feeding program. If you're experiencing some of those issues, revisit what you're doing. Make adjustments appropriately so that you don't have large lamb losses, especially due to simple starvation. Milk replacer, if you're going to use that, switch them as quickly as you can after birth and keep those lambs in a clean, dry area. And your goal is to get about half to a pound of milk replacer consumption a day, split between 2 feedings. Now, if you're going to do that, we're going to be pushing to wean them at about 3 weeks, primarily because of cost. It's just pretty expensive when you talk about using lamb milk replacer, but if you have to, do so if that makes your operation much more profitable. And then, as always, make sure that they have access to plenty of water and dry feed. The market lamb, again, those early lambs, maybe just wean. Make sure that they're healthy and eating dry feed by about 10 days of age. And here is a good time to be putting some creep feed in, increasing a little bit of risk on mama ewe. So weaning is at about 25 pounds body weight at about 25 to 30 days or so if we're talking about artificially reared. And mama ewe will wean a lamb on her own at about 40 pounds of body weight on that baby lamb if you just let her take care of it. So they normally rearing, the ewe will take care of weaning on her own. Take special caution at this time to reduce stress. If you have some operations that you want to do, some vaccinations or whatnot, try not to compound them through that weaning time. Try and minimize heat stress or cold stress through that time frame so that those lambs transition from a milk-based diet to your forage and grain-based diet as much as possible. Gain and conversions, we're talking about a 10 to 16% crude protein diet in this area here. And I would probably push them a little bit towards the high side here. Again, we're not spending a lot of money so you can afford to probably push them a little higher on protein. But they should gain pretty rapidly and very efficiently from 75 to 100 pounds body weight. After 100 pounds, we can probably start dropping them down to 13-14% diet to save cost. So you might ask, well, why would we even list 10% on the low end of the crude protein diet? I think that's probably too low. I don't think you're going to get enough structural growth on your lambs to be happy with them. So I would probably put that range at 14 to 16% instead of 10. The reason why you see some 10s out there, 10s to 12s or 10s to 14s, might be simply because those are mostly pastured animals and maybe poor quality pasture at that. You're going to find some producers that'll basically, whatever that creep ration is, that creep feed, that's the same diet that they get until about 100 pounds body weight. And it might be a 15% diet. And really the main reason for that is just it's very simple to do. Very simple feeding approach and makes it easy perspective. For grow finish lambs, just some shelled corn, some decent quality hay, and a little bit of supplement really takes these lambs a long way and keeps it very, very economical. And the BMP stands for Best Management Practices. So kind of a good list here. Start lambs on a complete pellet. Ensure intake into them as quick as you can. Vaccinate for enterotoxemia twice. That's overeating disease, folks. They will actually eat themselves to death. So a little vaccination there will take care of reducing that risk for you, hopefully. Make gradual ration changes, and it's listed 7 to 10 days here. Sheep are very sensitive in terms of ration changes, like most animals are, but they seem to be a little bit more sensitive yet. So if you're going to make ration changes, do those in a planned approach and try and stretch them out over a week to 10 days so that you don't shock them and cause them to have health issues and health outbreaks. Twice a day at regular time feeding is pretty crucial and pretty normally accepted with pretty high quality hay. You need about 12 inches of bunk space per lamb if you're talking about what to budget for in terms of size of a facility. Free choice salt and plenty of water as some methods. You might see something just like a self feeder, which is a labor saver. Does increase the amount of grain that they're probably going to consume. You might might see obviously a hand feeding system twice a day. The really good part about that is because you're out there 2 or 3 times a day, you're probably going to identify lambs that are not eating or sick or used that are off feed much quicker than a self feeder might, because you kind of tend to get a little bit lax and don't quite pay attention to how much they're eating. That's mostly used when you're feeding a little bit of silage, which isn't that common in ewes and lambs, but it is utilized out there. Pasture, you've got several different options. Use a little bit early and then finish lambs on grain, or pasture all the way till they're finished. You've got all kinds of opportunities out there in order to take advantage of what resources that you have. But if you go 100% pasture, it's going to take a little bit longer for your lambs to get a full finish on. But it does reduce, of course, your cost per pound of gain. Make sure that you keep your rations fortified to reduce diseases with minerals and vitamins and improve immune response. If you do get late lambs, good pasture, again, that's the key. We talked about that earlier. And some of your best gainers that you can market those right off the pasture and do pretty well on them, make pretty good money on those. I mentioned enterotoxemia in nursing lambs, which is an overeating disease, and it usually affects, for some reason, the largest and fastest gaining lambs. It's a virus that just kind of pops in and takes over, and that lamb just doesn't even know that it's eaten itself right to death at times. So you have to be cautious. It's a Clostridium perfringens type. I mentioned virus. It's a bacteria. Excuse me. That tends to take over in the gut, and basically you can treat it with an antitoxin for about 2 to 3 weeks, and that should help you out. But vaccinate those. That vaccination is effective for about 5 to 6 months at a time, and if you vaccinate the ewes about a month prior to lambing, you will help decrease that problem as well. As the other species, we talked about feeding our replacements, the replacement ewe lambs. Those breeding ewes as lambs, we want to be able to get them to lamb at about a year of age. So we ought to be able to get them of age. So the advantage is there. We get ewes into production sooner. We want to shorten the generational interval and increase genetic progress as much as you can. Identify the most productive ewes that are out there, and then control the diet to minimize overconditioning. We've talked about that a number. A few miscellaneous things that you might be able to utilize. Sheep is a good place to feed a little urea. Again, we've got a ruminant here, so you might be able to go up to 1.5% of the diet urea, but I would not recommend that for creep rations, range rations, or lamb rations with low energy. You want it to be a balanced approach. Probably use out on pasture or grow finish. Lambs is probably the best idea, but again, mix that carefully so they don't get a slug of it at a time. Additives and implants, you might be wise to put in some antibiotics early on in your lamb with a VFD, and working with your veterinarian. Maybe Chlorotet or oxytetracycline in your creep diets might be a good approach to do that. But be aware of feeding rates. Maybe under stressful conditions might be a good time to. Bovatech works good for coccidiosis control. They'll have that just like calves can, so that's a good thing to put in there. Ralgro in terms of implants are listed there, and then things like ammonium sulfate or chloride, about a 0.5% inclusion. That will generally reduce your risk of what we call urinary calculi. They'll get basically like kidney stones, and so we want to make sure that we're supplementing the correct amount of ammonium sulfate or chloride there. And not listed in here, but don't get carried away on your zinc or copper sulfate feeding. Um, Zinc feeding can be toxic. Copper sulfate at about 250 milligrams, I believe it is, per head per day can be toxic and fatal to sheep. So don't get carried away on something like that. And I guess bottom line, what I would say is make sure if you're feeding sheep, feed sheep mineral, feeds that are balanced for sheep. Don't go get a horse feed or a cattle feed or something like that and feed it to your sheep because you could be asking for trouble. Some take home messages, just like any ruminant, utilize high quality forages. That keeps your costs down. Maintain great quality pasture the best you can. That keeps your costs down. And then only supplement with grain, minerals, and vitamins as needed, and then help prevent those health challenges that we talked about briefly through the section here. So that kind of wraps up your section on sheep. Again, that's Unit 10. Hopefully, you've taken some good notes through this rather shortened section and bring those to class. Be ready to take your Kahoot and have your muddiest points next time, and then we'll talk about sheep feeding. We'll see you in class.